Greetings. On behalf of the Alliance of Asian American Baptist Churches, it's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Reverend Catherine Choy-Wong. Together with my colleagues, Reverend Amelia Chua, Catherine Shao, David Sen Nguyen, and Tan Man Lazum, we have been working on the Wholeness and Racial Reconciliation Project thanks to a Palmer Grant from the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. We held 3 sessions thus far. This last session, Building Bridges and Alliances, was held in May to look at how Asian American churches and leaders can work with Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American communities and churches on racism in the United States. This session was powerfully presented by 4 panelists. Reverend Dr. Trinette McCray is the president of American Baptist National Black Caucus. She is the past president of ABC USA, and currently she is the executive planner for the Urban Center, Milwaukee. She is also a Judson Press author and wrote a book called Vital Spirit, Vital Service, Spirituality That Works. Reverend Abner E. Cotto Borilla is the pastor of Mission Batista Hispania de Westchester in White Plains, New York. He is the current president of the National Hispanic Caucus of ABC USA and a member of the Board of Trustees of Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School. Reverend Wil Brown is the pastor of the First American Baptist Church in Hobart, Oklahoma, from 1993 to 1998, and then from 2008 to the present. He's the former national director of Indian Ministries of ABC USA and the former dean of students and college campus minister at Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He was educated at the Southwest Baptist University in Missouri and a graduate in Christian ministry and biblical studies. And our final panelist is Reverend Dr. Marie Onwubuariri. Reverend Dr. Marie Onwubuariri serves as the ABC USA Associate General Secretary for Mission Resource Development. And she has also been involved in cross-cultural ministries for many, many years and has been intentional in equity and inclusion and been developing in public ministries. She has joined the national staff. She has been a regional executive minister for Wisconsin, a seminary admissions director, a local church pastor, and the Asian Caucus president. She has served in many roles in ABC USA and bridging cross cultures. We invite you now to join us on this journey to build bridges and alliances across our ethnicities and cultures to combat racism. I now turn it over to the panelists. So we're going to start with the first question. And I'm going to start with Trinette on this one, and then Wil, then Abner, and then Marie. But to share briefly your personal experience with racism from your racial, ethnic, cultural background, what have you experienced and to share with us? Trinette, could you start first?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Katie, and thank you to the Asian Alliance for this focus and my opportunity to be involved with you. My experience, I take a deep breath because of the limitation of time, but we'll pull out some of the informative and transformative, thereby formative parts of my experience, and start with, as many of us would in my generation, as a child. I start with that beginning, but I won't go all the way to my 67 years. However, as a child, I had to be made aware of racism, of discrimination, of segregation, and of racial profiling. I had to be made aware of it. It would have been derelict of duty if my parents, my teachers, my neighbors, my church had not taught us the reality of our existence. It was a matter of survival. It was a matter of thriving, but it was also and a matter of protecting us, but also it was a matter of our knowing our current existence, but also where we were intending and determined to go. So growing up in the 1950s and through the 60s, 70s, and all the other decades from there. But however, in those critical decades, including the 80s, as a young adult and young professional. So my beginnings were beginning to understand what I couldn't say then were Jim Crow laws, but now know that they were the result of the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws in the US were laws that mandated the separation, supported and including laws that enforced the segregation and separation of persons on the basis of their race and racial identity, particularly for African Americans or Black people in that day. And so as a child growing up, not only going to the South and through the South, but people wouldn't believe that even in Milwaukee, there were Jim Crow laws that supported segregation. I remember as a child going down to a movie theater downtown for my first time with a friend of mine who happened to have been Hispanic. However, she appeared to be white. And we went down to go into the movie theater, and we were told that I could go to the balcony and she could go on the main floor. My friend, since it was both of our first time, said, well, then I'll go to the balcony with her. And we sat in the balcony downtown Milwaukee during these Jim Crow segregation laws. Not only that, as a child driving to the South where my parents were still living and relatives, we had to have the conversation of what it would mean for us being in a car driving south. Going south, we could not, because of Jim Crow laws, we could not use facilities. Facilities were whites only. They had colored bathrooms at gas stations and rest stops, but those were unsuitable. They were not maintained. They were unclean. And so we traveled with our own toilet paper. And I can remember as a child being cautioned as we were taken to a bush off the side of the road and we had to relieve ourselves there. And as well as traveling with our own breakfast, lunch, and food, all packed up in our car for the journey because we could not stop and eat at any restaurants or go into any markets. Here back in Milwaukee again, I recall freedom schools that really launched in 1964 in Mississippi, but there was a freedom school also here in Milwaukee. It was in protest of the segregation of schools and the need for better facilities, teachers, and curriculum. And so I can recall our parents asking, did we want to take out of school, because we'd be marked absent, and attend the freedom schools in connection with the boycotts that were happening across the country and started in Mississippi. I took part in a freedom school that our churches collaborated and were open to hosting those freedom schools. This is to give you an idea that my information and my formation led to who I am today and my experiences that I had. Now, just closing out, the housing segregation that Milwaukee is known for being the most segregated city in this country started with the housing segregation in which covenant laws were passed and residents, homeowners in certain communities were allowed to pass these laws. I remember buying my home in 1986. It was my first purchase. And the white neighbor across the street, of course, I was only the third African-American to buy in. She came to me and said, I was not supposed to be here because they had signed a covenant and covenanted with each other that they would not sell their homes to any Black people so as to keep their neighborhood white. That was 1986. I was 35 years old. It's not that long ago. And that's just a brief sense of my information, my formation that's led to my transformation to live and rise above and help transform our country to being a better place.
Thank you, Trinette. Painful stories, and like you said, it's not even that long ago. So appreciate that. And I again appreciate the panelists because I know that the stories could go on, and I thank you, Trinette. We're going to ask Wil to share from your own experience and from your community. What have you experienced?
All right. Well, I'm glad to be a part of this panel and this discussion. I'm glad that you asked me in the Asian Alliance, and I consider it a privilege to do this. Yes, I could talk about this all day. Me too, but I know we have limited time here. You know, how I have been affected by it, and my family has been affected by it throughout the years. As you know, Native American people, we have, I think we have experienced it from even, I guess, after Christopher Columbus so-called discovered America, but in 1492. But I know that when I look at my life and how I've experienced it, you know, going back to my early childhood years, you know, it was out there. I saw it. They're putting Native American people all in the same category, you know, whether you were educated, not educated, whether you're poor, whether you're rich, or you lived, the clothes you wore. But they generally put this all in just all as one person, just in the same category, you know. And still to this day, to some degree, it's like that. Maybe not as much, you know, but it's still there, you know. And if they see one Native American who is homeless or is hitting real hard, you know, or doesn't have nothing, they look at this like, well, you're just like that, you know, and they don't even know who I am. When I lived in Moore, Oklahoma, in my early 70s, I saw a lot of that. More at that time in the early 70s, seemed like Native American were treated as second and third class people. I don't know if you remember that group called the American Indian Movement. Back in 1972, they took over a church in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and they held that for 72 days. That was on World News Tonight and all that back then. And because they felt like Native American people were not being recognized, they were saying that you don't treat us the same, you know, and you have not kept any treaties, and we are living with them today. There are 567 federally recognized tribes or nations in the United States. Approximately almost about 2 million Native American people of the 569 tribes. That's not even counting the state recognized tribes. And my tribe, the Kiowa people from Oklahoma, we're about 12 to 15,000. My wife's tribe, I'm of the Kiowa and Acoma Pueblo tribe. My mother is Kiowa from Oklahoma, and my dad is Acoma from Western New Mexico. My wife is of the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana, and her tribe is very, very small, about 800 in enrollment. And they were just federally recognized back in 1974. I know when I was growing up, I was in junior high. I remember I was told I had long hair. I still got long hair, but I had long hair back then. I was told that you can't come to school with your long hair. You're gonna have to cut it. I was in seventh grade, and I said, why? And they said, well, our school policy states that you cannot come to school with your long hair. I said, well, this is my culture. This is who I am. This is who I identify with. And so I know it was a big thing to do back then, you know. And I had to cut my hair, or they would not let me back to school. You know, years later, that policy was changed, and also my dad in his time, he was told not only to cut his hair, but he couldn't speak his language. You know, of who he was and what he was because of his Native American background. So he could not speak his language in school. Of course, that has all changed in recent years. Now they want you to, speak the language, and it's not so much about the long hair no more. So, these things I have experienced. The Native American people, I think, we have a voice, but sometimes it's not heard because we're so small in numbers, and we have so much to give. Just recently, the current president appointed a Native American woman to a cabinet position. I think the Secretary of Interior, and that's the first time a Native American man or woman had been appointed to a high-level position like that, and that was a first. And I was really glad to hear that. So anyway, here where I live in Hobart, Oklahoma, it's a population of about 2,100, and it's mainly a farming community. And there's probably the Native American population probably is about, I'll say about 5 or 6%. There used to be more, but most of them have moved out. I pastor the only Native American church here in Hobart, and we've been here since 1892. This church, the Hobart community here, I feel like throughout the years I've been here since '92, has looked down upon the Native American people. They don't treat us the same. I'm probably the most well-known Native person here in this town, because I've had opportunities to be on the school board and speak on baccalaureate and things like that. So, but I feel like still that our Native voice has not been heard because I guess they just put us all in the same category. Anyway, I could talk more and more, but these are some of the things that I've experienced in my lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. We know, one of the most invisible groups in America are Native Americans, and so it's something that Native Americans have faced for a long time and still do. And so the visibility of Native Americans now with the cabinet member hopefully will be a hopeful sign of things to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite Abner to share from his community what's happening and his own experience with racism and prejudice and bias and your story, Abner.
Yes, can you hear me, Will?
Yes, I hear you.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie, for your leadership, and thank you to the Asian Alliance for giving me this opportunity. I want to start sharing that racism in the Hispanic or Latino community is a complex one, and part of this maybe introduction or information is part of my life, because I didn't grow up here in the US. I grew up in Puerto Rico. I have it will be 6 years here, 1 year living in Boston and 5 years in New York. And it is very interesting because when we hear the term Hispanic or Latino, Latina, it is a term to a whole group here in the US, but we have different histories, identities, stories, cultural background, social political background, and in that sense, it is a little bit complex. It is a little bit complex when, for example, when you go to Hispanic congregation, to Hispanic community, and I can talk racism from my perspective living in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean, and maybe the area of the Latin America, that there is racism there. People who migrated to Puerto Rico from Dominican Republic, they were discriminated from Puerto Ricans. The same people who migrated from Haiti to Dominican Republic, they were discriminated from people from Dominican Republic. There has been conflict between people from Venezuela and Colombia, and we have that. And when we are united here, we come from those backgrounds that are that is discrimination and injustice. But here in the US, we can talk about racism and the experience that we have had about immigration, about the separation of families recently or during this year. I remember going to El Salvador. I was taking a course from Yale, and we went to El Salvador. And that was the time of the separation of families. And we went to the office, and the person told us that daily 30, 40 parents were deported. And at the same time, they didn't know where were their children. And it was very difficult to track in that part. We can see also racism in the sense of workers. Many Hispanic and Latino, they are looking for work on the streets, people who don't have documents. And sometimes they start to work and they work many hours, 12, 30, 13 hours daily, and without benefits and without the regular things that a worker can have. And often owners take advantage of that, knowing that this person don't have document or doesn't have documents. I will take advantage, and if this person act maybe against me, I will treat them to deport them in that sense. And that is the conflict that maybe many people looking for the American dream here in the US, they are facing, because I would say that 90% of the workers and many people from Latin America, from the Caribbean, that come here from work or to work, they send money to their families, because the oppression that they are living there, it's very, very strong, very high in that sense. In my experience as a Puerto Rican, and again, as a Puerto Rican, my history is different to a Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadorian person, because Puerto Rico is part or is a territory of the US. Not many people from here, from the US, know that. Sometimes people think that all Latino or Latinas, they are Mexican, and I have heard that as well. Actually, people, when they see me, they think that I am from Venezuela. And it is very interesting, because as a Puerto Rican, in documents, we are American citizens, but in heart and feelings, we are from Latin America. We are from the Caribbean. And I think one of the experiences that I can share personally, in the first year that I was here in the US, in my first year, I went to a ballpark. I love baseball, and I went to see the Washington Nationals playing against another team. And when I asked for a lemonade in this booth, I said lemonade, because Hispanic is limonada. And I said that incorrectly, and I said, can I have a lemonade? And the person looked at me and said, what? And can I have a lemonade? What? And again, asking what, and for me it was very confusing. And then she looked at me, to my eyes, and she said lemonade. It was like very, I don't know what word to use, but I feel like I was a moron, or, and I said, okay, can I have a lemonade? And I had another experience in a post office. I forgot a word, and I was trying to look in the word, and I said a word incorrectly. And I saw this white man in the line laughing at me for that. And it was like, oh. But yes, we can have different experiences. Even though we are Latino or Latina or Hispanic, we come from different places with differences, and that makes us complex at the same time. It is very interesting, because in our meetings, when we have a meeting, for example, in the biennial, you have that different countries, people from different countries thinking. And one of the things is that we speak one language, Spanish, but we have different accents, different, the words maybe can be different. A word in Puerto Rico can be used as a good word, but maybe in Mexico it's different. And we have learned that during the process. And as a pastor, definitely, I have heard many people from my congregation that they have been treating it bad by cops and other people as well.
Thank you, Abner. That's something we have in common with the Hispanic Latino community is the lumping us all together. So we'll hear more about that in a little bit. I'm going to turn to Marie, and Marie will share more from the Asian American experience and her own personal.
Thank you. Good to be with everyone, and good to be home, in reference back to Amelia's introduction. The Asian Alliance has been home for me in ABC USA, and so it's good to be with you and with my friends on the panel. So for context, I was born in the Philippines and immigrated early 70s with my family. I was an infant at that time. So grew up in Queens, New York, which was a very international neighborhood. So that's sort of contextually how I grew up. So when I think about this question, and particularly think about overt racism, so racism that can be seen based on actions or words or impact to someone's life. As a Filipino American, it's not necessarily an easy question for me to answer. And my fellow panelists certainly gave a lot of examples of what that looks like. In fact, my first recollection of a formative overt experience was in Hong Kong. I was there, I was in mid-20s, and one of the greatest boosts to the Filipino economy are the OFWs, or overseas Filipino workers. And so there's a lot of domestic workers in Hong Kong, and my impression is that they're seen as a class, a working class there. And I was with a Chinese family and enjoying a weekend, a holiday weekend there. And we were on a bridge that was going toward kind of the shore or the port. And there were signs all across this bridge that kind of said like no loitering, like don't gather on the bridge, no loitering, which from New York was a very negative sign. And it was often in Spanish or in other languages. And it was in Tagalog. And that was like my first kind of like, oh, okay, so we're kind of lumped as this sort of problem population. And so it was striking to me that I was overseas to kind of experience that. But I'm on this continuous journey of learning about the different ways that racism makes its face or shows its face. And in addition to overt racism, there's a lot of different other forms of it. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to learn more about, learn how it makes itself known in my life. And so examples of other forms that I've experienced, and I'm sure my panelists have experienced similar things as well, is, so for one example would be in any kind of Western dominant setting, I have had to go away from my cultural default and learn how to be self-assertive or self-promoting to put myself in a position where I can contribute what I believe God has given me to contribute, right? So that's another, assimilation is another word for that. I've had to be like the dominant in order to fit in or even be seen or even be valued at the table, but only do it appropriately enough, right? Because I'm still Asian and I'm still a woman. And so there's still mental models of what I should be doing or acting like. Another example would be I've had to endure uncomfortable conversations that go something like this. Oh, so where are you from? Oh, I'm from New York, but where are you from? Okay, I'm from the Philippines. Oh, you're Filipina. And when I was stationed in the Philippines, fill in the blank, right? And so there would be stories hearkening back to when US had very lively bases in the Philippines. And often there were undertones in this conversation of, oh, Filipinos are so friendly or Filipinos are so hospitable, but also undertones of, oh, Filipinos are submissive and they please people. And so it just became a very objectifying conversation. And then probably the most impactful, which still takes intentional and hard work, is unpacking the forms of internalized racism, internalized oppressions, specifically from Filipino context. Colonial mentality is another form of that. And that dates back hundreds of years of colonial experience in the Philippines, and particularly over 120 years of colonial impact, specifically from the United States, and how that has formed how Filipinos see the US, see Americans, and put ourselves into that larger narrative. And because of one of the effects of colonialism is it's hard for you to recognize racism because you're taught to appreciate, to be thankful, to want to be like, and that's perhaps leading into the second question. So I'll kind of pause there.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Yes, and you're going to be starting the second question pretty soon. Yeah, it's definitely colonialism is is racism, and one of the things that the white dominant society has done is to be able to import the racist attitudes across the whole globe, and so that's something that that is still the remnants of that still exists here. The next questions actually can be two to combine, and you can answer it however you seem appropriate. I'm going to have a restart it. Is what are the stereotypes perpetuated on your racial ethnic group? And how do these stereotypes, for you, Marie, how did these stereotypes interact with the Asian stereotype of being a model minority and a perpetual foreigner?
Okay. So I was trying to think about if there are stereotypes particular to Filipinos, and had to call a couple of my, friends. What have you experienced? But so one of them is just, you're all nurses, right? So there's an assumption we're all nurses. That we all love karaoke, as you know, with stereotypes, they're partially true, right? They're not the full story, but they're not completely untrue, right? So I love karaoke. I'm not a nurse, but I have a lot of nurses in my extended family. But also, so related to karaoke is entertainment, right? Like we love singing, dancing. So there's that stereotype. I think growing up, there was an assumption that we were all Spanish speaking, right? Because of a lot of our last names were Spanish. And so there was a confusion sort of who we were. And then I know folks that, from a negative perspective, sort of the racial slurs of, you all eat dogs, or you have, smelly food, right? So, heard that growing up. So related maybe to the second question of how this relates to sort of some of the larger Asian stereotypes, the PBS series on Asian Americans calls this episode The Good Americans. And so model minority and perpetual foreigner may not necessarily be applied to Filipinos in the same way or in the same depth as to maybe East Asians. But I think that we have a version of that, of being good Americans, and that's again related to the colonial mentality. Part of colonial mentality is this sense of self-hate or self-shame, where you deny or hide your cultural identity in order to assimilate into white dominant society. That wasn't my personal experience because I did grow up in a very international setting, so I didn't feel that pressures of being Filipino against a larger dominant, because we were all kind of, minorities, quote unquote. But certainly noticed that among a lot of my extended cousins who lived in suburbs and things like that. But my experience was maybe more implicitly not self-hate, because we always felt prideful about being Filipino, but certainly there was more effort in raising us in US white culture. So for example, I was not taught my native tongue so that I can speak English without an accent, right? So till this day, I grieve the fact that I'm not a fluent Filipino speaker. And so it was good intentions, but that was, part of the push for assimilation. When I think about family trips, family vacations, we vacationed to learn about US white dominant history, right? So I went to Valley Forge when I was a young kid. We went to these other major US sites. So I learned about US history from that perspective, but I didn't learn about Asian history in the US or Black history in the US or even Native American history in the US. So there was a push to be more of that white American. Part of it too was I did hear stories of my home country on occasion, but it was mostly under the guise of either, you know, it was so hard for us from my dad's side. And so that was sort of a slide way to say, appreciate where you are, right? Like just make the best of your opportunity here in the US and don't make waves, just do good, take the opportunities. Or from my mom's side, who was more kind of middle class, where she said, you know, where it was like, we don't have to be here, right? We didn't come here necessarily for a better life, but you're here and you're expected to do well. So some of that spilled over into this model minority. Don't be a troublemaker, keep your head down, do well in school, take the most that the US has for you. And different maybe from other Asians is because of that intricate history with the US, we believed we belonged here because of that connection. At least like post civil rights, post 1960s immigrants, a lot of my Filipino extended family that came here, it was natural, right? Like, so we saw ourselves as belonging here. We spoke English when we came. And so it was easier to assimilate.
Okay, thank you, Marie.
Yep.
I invite any of the other panelists to jump in and to answer this. What are the stereotypes perpetuated on your community, and how does that relate to the Asian stereotypes that you heard Marie talk about? Abner?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I can say there are some words. And the past president, he used some of these words. Aliens. I think, you know, people who were coming from here, but they don't belong here. And again, they have seen as an inferior. Once, I think it was in a debate that the president, the past president, said that the Mexicans are rapists. And many people who know a Mexican, they think, oh, this is a rapist, this is a rapist. And I think that has been very bad for the community. And communist, the term communist is very common that, all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, they are communist. And yes, at some point, there are many others, but those are the ones that have been like present in the past years. I don't know if you have heard, and I think we can all talk about this, that we don't belong here, go to your country. Mm-hmm. And another thing is that we speak English, we don't speak Spanish here. The language of the United States is English. And yes, in the Hispanic community, many people have experienced those stereotypes that maybe another language is inferior than English, that English is the language that we have to talk. And obviously, if we are here, most of us speak English, but if one person is speaking Spanish, for example, it's treated bad. It's treated bad in that sense. I think the question 3, one of the things that I can share is the sense of tokenism. And as a student, when I was studying, and maybe with different groups within the ABC and the National Council of Churches, we talk about that many seminaries, universities, they want diversity in number, but in the sense of the practice, diversity is not present. I have been in places that I have been invited, but then when I talk, I am not listening. It's like I am in another part, and I know that this is present in some of the minority groups. Yes, and I think that sense of tokenism, it's very bad. It's very bad. It's very bad.
Thank you. Yeah, tokenism across the board. Wil or Trinette, who wants to jump in?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, stereotypes. That's something that I have experienced in my lifetime, and still from time to time it does come up. Not as much as it was when I was younger. Let's go back to just look at the movies. You know how the westerns back in the 60s and 70s, 50s project Native American people. you know, of course, they never used any Native people to act. Or, you know, there's always they made up somebody, you know, and the words they used in the movies and the scenes and all that, and we're so wrong, you know, history, and even our history books in recent years have been updated. I remember back in the 70s when I was in high school, back here in Oklahoma, the state legislature passed a bill to update Oklahoma's history because it was outdated of how they were looking at the Native American people, you know, and so they passed it back in the late 70s, and it was all updated. Now students have the recent history of Oklahoma Native American people when they study American history, Oklahoma history in high schools now. I know that when I was growing up, I would hear this a lot. You know, that Native American people or Indian people get everything free. You know, everything's free. Everything's handed to you. You know, you're a child of the government. You know, and that's not true. That's not true. You know, we pay taxes like everybody else. You know, and nothing is handed to us. You know, now I admit now on Indian reservations it is different there. You know, they have but yet I'm an urban Indian, and we have experienced more. I guess we've done things on our own. We're try to let others know that we are not like that. You know, that we take care of our own. I think that generally speaking, it's how people look at Native American people. Of the 569 federally recognized tribes, you know, I know when I used to do a lot of speaking when I was working for national ministries, and I went, you know, different churches and conferences, and from time to time, I would, you know, of course, I would get when the time for question and answers, I would get some very well, like where are you coming from? You know, like do y'all still live in teepees? Y'all still hunt buffalo? I'm serious too. They're not. I mean, serious questions like that. You know, no, we don't live in teepees no more. We don't hunt the buffalo. We eat it, but we don't hunt it like like that. And you know, but it's because of, I guess, a lack of ignorance or whatever, how people see Native American people, especially, you know, the Anglo or the white society look at us. I know that here in Oklahoma, we are called the home of the red man, you know, and we are the most populated state in the union with Native American population. You know, of course, back east, it's less. You go central Oklahoma, central United States, and western United States, it's more. But it's something that we have to live with. We have to change. But like I said, you know, a person who is not a Native person looks at Native American people, generally speaking, not all, and they throw us in the same category, you know, and that's not true, you know. And but there are some who live that kind of life, and I think that's just how they were raised, you know. And of course, I was raised in a Native home. I was raised in a Christian home, and I was raised in my Native American tradition. Also, I was raised in the, you know, the white man ways, and Christianity has always been a part of my life, and I've learned to live in both worlds. That's what I'm trying to say. Live in both worlds, to adapt in both worlds, and sometimes that's not very easy to do, you know. And I try to teach that to my children. They don't. This generation, I see, is not experiencing it as much as I did, or even my parents, or more so my grandparents' generation, you know. But stereotypes are out there, and slowly they are being changed.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
Trinette?
Hi. Yeah, we have. You know, there have been the historic, what we would call the historic stereotypes, and the more contemporary ones. Some of the contemporary ones stem from the historic. So just in the sense of the historic stereotypes. There's I would remember driving around in the South, in some areas of upper northern Wisconsin, in which you'd see this Black Sambo statue or figurine on front porches. And for those who might not know what that is, that would be a very, very black-skinned boy or man dressed in a red jacket and white pants and boots. And it was just little Black Sambo, which was a part of the stereotype that came out of historically. Then there's the mammy, in which you always had the overweight Black woman, and it, dressed in, full dress and generally taking care of family and home and food. That's perpetrated. Mostly we saw in films carried out in movies. You can watch some of those old movies today and see that stereotype. The Mandingo stereotype of the strong Black male with the sexual, physical veracity. And that also in movies and films carried forward. That's to name some, and there are others today in the contemporary that Black people are drug dealers, Black people are thieves. I even experienced the stereotype in my own young adult professional life. Back in the day when we carried regular briefcases, leaving my job and going into an office supply store to look for some supplies, and carrying my briefcase, having the supplies in my hand, going to the counter to pay for the ones that I am buying, and having the store clerk ask me, now, would you put your briefcase up and open it? And I asked him, why would he want me to open my briefcase? As such, to say, so I can see the ones that you're stealing. I took offense right there, challenged him at the counter, because there was a white male in line behind me who he was not asking for him to display anything that might have been under his coat. So that journey of stereotypes we all experience, the sense of the welfare queen, that most Black women are on welfare. Most present is the angry Black woman. And we can see that whenever in politics today, or in any kind of confrontation today, or discussion even, if we are in any ways passionate, our passion gets labeled an angry Black woman. We can see that played out even in the not the George Floyd trial, the Chauvin trial, in which the one man who was a witness and the defense attorney kept trying to say, you were angry, you were upset. And he said, you are not going to be able to label me as an angry Black man. I am not an angry Black man. And the defense attorney tried to come back at him again in other language to get him to say, but you were upset, you were angry. And he said again, no, you're not going to paint me as having been angry. I was not angry. And I was calm. I was in control of myself. So we have those stereotypes that affect our children. Our Black boys in schools are often treated as though they're naughty, they're bad, and anything that they might do that any other student of any other race would do is colored as they're acting out, and therefore they get more punishment, more expulsions. And I've even had the experience of my nephew being placed out into the hall during class and excluded or segregated off from the other students. So we have to watch over our children very diligently to make sure they're not being treated by these stereotypes. Just to say a couple more, and then I'll end. We know the stereotype of Black males and now females who are very athletic and strong. The basketball stereotype. I know you're going to grow up and be a great basketball player, but we've broken through that one. We've got great tennis stars, golf, swimming, and et cetera across the athletes. We're unruly, we're loud, we're dirty, we're intellectually slow, we're cognitively slow. We're just all around bad people. Stereotypes of Black people that persist today.
Unfortunately, our country has many stereotypes of people of color. And the assumption, of course, in stereotypes is that people of color are not the norm either. And the white dominant society is the norm. Well, our last question. Sure.
I'm sorry, just one quick thing.
Yeah.
I've traveled overseas into other countries. They see the movies
Yes.
that the stereotypes perpetrate. So I am assumed to be that person
Yes.
that they have
Yes.
seen through the movies. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
It's
that's
overseas.
true. Yeah, and that's what I meant by the earlier when I said colonialism is global. The racism is perpetuated across the whole world, and a lot of that has to do with the media. One of the things that was said early on in our sessions was Asians who come from other countries, Asian countries, who never had experience with Blacks or Black people in those countries, come here already with a preconceived idea of who Blacks are. And how did they get, the question was, how did we get that idea? Mm-hmm. And of course, is what has been imported around the world. So it is so racism isn't just a American problem.
Yeah,
it is a global problem. It is a very global problem. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because when we look at the Asian and African American relationships, much of it comes from how we're treated by persons of Asian descent when we come into the stores or shops and other things. So yeah, thanks for saying that.
Right. Yeah, and I think also we talked about, well, we didn't talk about this, but one of the things that we said was also those of us who see that happening, like for instance, an Asian person seeing an Asian shopkeeper discriminating against a Black person or assuming a Black person is stealing, we feel like we have to defend and say and defend our Asian people. And that's part of racism too, is that we have to always defend. Why do we need to defend? Because obviously that is that particular shop owner that has done that, or that has been that particular. One of the things that was said was some of the attacks not only has been white people attacking Asians, but there have been Black people attacking Asians during this pandemic time. And so one of the, there was another time that I was on another panel where a Black person, pastor said, well, why do we have to defend that Black person? It's what the dominant society has put us into. And it doesn't represent, why do we have to say that particular person represents all Asians or all Blacks? And that's one of the problems. So leading into that, Trinette, thank you, is how do we build bridges then? Because we bring in all these biases. Marie talked about internalized racism. Internalized racism, we have been acculturated or inundated with these concepts and these prejudices and biases. How do we sift through all that to go and begin building really authentic bridges across all our ethnicities so that we can really tackle what racism really is, the dominant society's racist system that has been put in place. So that's the question I had, is have you seen how bridges can be built, or you have ideas of how we can build alliances with each other? Any of the panelists would like to answer that, basically.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I want to just kind of circle back to the last comment from Trinette. Yeah, and I resonate with that. Like what I was going to say, part of what I noticed even growing up in New York, that it was a very international and multicultural area, is I would often hear, and it was in the time where there was a lot of crime, just like kind of personal crime, people getting jumped, theft, things like that. And I would hear in my own communities, often it was named, they were Latino or African-American. And I know that was part of being influenced by what media, what was being said on media. And I know, as I reflected back, I know that's not just who was doing it, right? I mean, gangs were a big issue growing up, and we had Asian gangs, right? We had gangs of all ethnicities, but what was being pointed out were particularly those of brown and Black, or Latino and Black. And so in answering your question, Katie, I think intra-group conversations for us to get real with ourselves about these stereotypes that we have of other people of color. And I know I believe in the value of cross-cultural things like this, but I think even within Filipino communities or Chinese community, whatever, like within our own communities, really have honest conversations about what, with education, about how we're being influenced, and dispel those biases, dispel and educate about how those are tools that are being used, is the starting place. And even really thinking toward the youth or young adults. And so early on, about a year ago, I've had some who were in our Burmese diaspora communities, younger people, who would tell me about things that were being said at their home and how it made it difficult with them in their school settings, or even younger generations within their own churches of some of the older generations, and how to approach those kind of conversations. So I think that's a starting place for education, and I'm happy to see we've been doing that. And then when we get to cross-culturally, what I noticed when I went to Myanmar and Malaysia is, in Malaysia, like meeting young people, young adults who were real strong leaders in their communities and had the sense of agency and helping their own communities in their situations of marginalization and oppression. In Myanmar, there was this sense of like lack of agency, right? Because of the oppression that they're feeling there and a lack of opportunities. And in listening to some of the young people, just kind of resonating with what we hear from some young people in marginalized communities in the US. And so with the younger, I feel that they are easier to cross cultures as far as communication and relationships, but maybe really talking about things like agency and how we are a country where we teach people that you can make a difference. And that is something different than I think when people immigrate here, like what they might experience in their own country. So learning from each other how each community have risen above these challenges, particularly getting the young people involved.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel? Abner? Yeah.
Yes, I would say, and following Mary in the sense of conversations, listening, but a way of education, of presence at the same time. I remember that verse of John when Jesus went to Philip. Philip knew Jesus, and then Philip went to Nathaniel. And it was the part when Philip said, "He's from Nazareth." And then, "From Nazareth? Are you kidding me?" And then he said, "Come and see." I think many discrimination is for cultural illiteracy in that way. I really appreciate the work and the book of Paulo Freire. I don't know if you have read that book, the Brazilian Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And one of the things that I see of culture is that our self-defense is to oppress other. We have been oppressed, and our self-defense is to oppress other. And I think his main goal is that in his book, From the Oppression, I teach the oppressed how and why have they been oppressed. At the same time, I teach the oppressor to understand how are they oppressing other people. The goal is to teach the oppressed not to learn from the oppressor how to oppress others. And I think sometimes we do that. And we have to have these connections of learning about cultures. And I know this is very challenging, but it's not impossible. And I remember Lamin Sane, a professor that I had about world Christianity, he said once that the worst oppression is that one when the oppressed learn from the oppressor to oppress his or her own group. And you can see that in the Hispanic community as well. How people with documents that they have been many years here in the US, they are pressing people who don't have documents, and I think that happens as well within different cultures or among different cultures. And I think that conversation is very good, but also the presence, in the sense to come and see, not only to hear but also see, is very important to that bridge, to building bridges.
Thank you. Okay. Wil or Trinette?
Okay, yes, building bridges in communities. I think one way, and I've seen it done, but it's not done enough, is I guess educating people about different cultures, backgrounds, stereotypes, racism, and things like that. But I see it being done, but it's not being done enough, and because we a lot of times, I think an individual is brought up in an environment that they just see through just what's in front of them. They have blinders on. They see what's in front of them, and they're raised in that kind of environment, and it's hard for them to step outside the box, and to see anything different and new. I know from being a minister, being a pastor, when I want to get to know a family, I spend time with that family. I spend time with that person. I get to know that individual, that family. And so I can relate to them better. I can understand them better from who they're, where they're coming from. And, but that's probably the best way. But of course, that's not going to happen most of the time, but I think if somehow that we can break through that and step outside the blocks and begin to educate individuals, families, communities about who we are, what we are. Just like my people, the Cotto tribe. If I was asked my neighbor about my tribe and all that, they would not know, or very little what they know, where we come from, who we are, what we are. And so I think that's one way we can do it. But a lot of times, like I said, people are comfortable with the surroundings, and it's how you were brought up and how you were raised has a lot to do with it. If you were around a lot of different ethnic groups or people of different color, and just around your own, that's all you know. And sometimes it's out of ignorance, and that's how that's how they perceive others who are of who they are, like I'm Native American, or how they perceive a Black person or an Asian person. They have their stereotypes of who they are, or what they are, and that's really sad. And still, this country is still living with that to some degree, and I think that if we somehow can educate our people, our communities in a better way, however that may be done, I don't know. That's a big question right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Trinette, we're going to end with you.
Okay, so I'm only going to mention about just two areas, I think. When the 6 women were killed in Georgia, there was a lot of chatter on Facebook by some of my younger, some of my former college students and younger, and in that generation. And while there is compassion, there's also a call coming from that group. And I think that's going to be the most active group. It's the generations behind me. And that is, they're calling for not just the response to the Asian hate and murders and attacks that have been going on, but hey, we've been having confrontations, movements, protests, and actions going on nationally. And we need to see, or would want to see, that same Asian community joining forces with the movements that's going on now. And combining our efforts and not singling out efforts, because divided we will fall, united we'll stand. And that's what I see as one change that could happen to make us a stronger group together. Not just AAIP Stop Hate, but also Black Lives Matter and who shows up in those, and not just the protests, but the changes in their communities will affect all of us. Secondly, one is there are these affirmative action lawsuits or challenges being taken place at Harvard and other upscale colleges that Asian students and families are bringing forward, stating that affirmative action, which certainly was put in place to aid and assist underrepresented and other discriminated groups, primarily African Americans, from getting into those schools. Now Asian Americans are saying they're being affected by that because they're worthy of entrance but can't get in because the seats or slots are being taken up by affirmative action. I think we have to have a way of working that out that doesn't place a not them but us into our system. That's not going to benefit our relationship going forward, our helping each other going forward, nor will it benefit either of our communities going forward.
Thank you. So really good, healthy conversations. Marie had a couple of resources you want to mention?
Yeah, just quickly. One, I put in the chat a link. Related to that is action, right? So if you can find a sister church where you have a common interest, whether it is an education, whether it is a social justice issue, like local to your community, a resource that they've been doing this and can have maybe some learnings from the previous groups, and also I believe still have some funding, is the New Baptist Covenant. And they're called Covenants of Action, where congregations of different racial backgrounds come together to work on something. And then Trinette mentioned higher ed. I mean, we've got so many great seminaries that are doing so much beyond their degree program. So they're doing programs that are accessible to churches and congregations. This little cross on my little background here was something of, an Asian Black worship conference that came out of a seminary. So this is a nod to that, but there's so many resources out there. So I know we get overwhelmed, but it's just a matter of tapping into the great work that's being done and finding ways to connect them.
Okay. Well, again, thank the panelists. We have some time for quick question and answer. I guess I'm going to ask permission, but I'm going to go ahead and take our 10 minutes. But if you have additional questions or your questions were not being able to be answered verbally, please put that in the chat. And we are going to save the chats, and we could certainly, and I asked the panelists if it's okay, we can forward some of those questions to you, and perhaps you may have some ideas, resources, and responses to those questions. Yeah, I know we don't have a lot of time, so that we want to make sure that you are able to ask your questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get the responses out to you by email as a follow-up. So I'm going to ask that we have the total view, and then are there any questions from the audience, from the participants?
So hi, hello. So my name is Sebastian. I'm the senior pastor at the First Chinese Baptist Church. I have two questions, and they are not related. But the first question is this. Our church is intentionally laying the groundwork for having conversation with a Black church. I want to know if there are questions. How can we ask questions without offending, the other people? Because I understand that sometimes out of ignorance we may ask racist questions. Is that okay? Or is there something that we need to be sensitive over? So that's my first question. The second question is a response to what Marie just said about, she has to sort of divorce herself from her cultural default because, in a white dominant setting, you have to become assertive and so that you can be heard. Now, so is that something to be avoided? I mean, I feel that So how much should we sort of come out of our cultural habits, and we're asked to, hey, speak up, don't be a moral minority. So how can we sort of come to have a balance?
Okay. Any of the panelists like to answer that?
I'll respond to the second question. So one of the things, I think it's a great question, and no, I think we can't, that's not the answer, is just to continue to divorce ourselves from our cultural defaults, but working within our systems to really look at how decisions are made and changing that, right? So looking at how to structure meetings in a way that it's not just whoever is the loudest at the table gets heard, but how is data, how is input being brought in from all different ways. So even just looking at process, that's sort of one of my areas that I try to pay attention to, so that different styles of interacting find their way, and it's not abnormal, but it becomes the normal, that we incorporate different ways of communicating and contributing.
Any other panelists?
I will respond to the first question, and that is how to hold conversations amongst, I guess, between diverse groups where there may be the misunderstandings of use of language and or the question to not offend or otherwise. And so there are processes and ways to hold those kinds of sensitive or critical conversations. But they do need to be facilitated. There is a process to having and establishing mutual norming that everyone understands what I would call the fault lines might be in a conversation. And there certainly are those. And there are in advance acknowledgements, or when an offense happens, you keep an acknowledgement sheet and you acknowledge that this might be offensive, or yes, an offense occurred. It's how we handle and can break down before conversation offense, in that we don't always have to be offended. We can acknowledge that that is just something that requires grace. So we have grace notes that we will keep and administer to each other in those conversations. So not to go on too much longer on that, but to just say there are skills and ways of doing and holding those kinds of conversations.
Another question from someone? Yes, Tommy, I guess.
Yes. Hi, Amelia. It's been a little while. Hi. I'm a member of Sebastian's Church, First Chinese Baptist Church, and Pastor Sebastian has done a great job of working with the African American community in San Francisco, and in particular, we have a personal friend of mine is Black. I live in San Jose, which is 50 miles south of San Francisco, but I attend church in San Francisco. That's where I grew up. But my good friend is one of the leaders of the Black community here in the South Bay in San Jose, as well as he's well connected in San Francisco and Oakland. So he and I have these heart-to-heart talks, and to answer what the lady had said before that, he and I are very honest with each other. We, because we have this relationship, I've known this guy for 30 years, so we can really say things that are on our mind, and he knows we have that mutual understanding that, hey, we just say things because I don't know how to say it. I'm not saying it in disrespectful, but we just don't know. But I think this whole thing, I've attended many workshops, and I've been very involved in this stuff, and I feel that we're understanding the other peoples of color is very important, and educating at home with our generation. We've had some comments with my wife and I with friends using old slang terms that Chinese people use, and we try to change that, but it's hard to change a guy who's been doing this for 50-something years. But we're working on that, and I understand that we want to work with this in the communities with the young people, educating. That's going to take time. I understand that. But my concern is while this is taking time, how do we stop these assaults on Asians now that are happening?
Mhm.
Because all these, I think that's one of those things. It's the elephant in the room there. How do we stop these things? And like somebody has said, it's not all Black people, white people, whatever. We get a mixture of people, unfortunately, doing these assaults. But what do we do in the meantime?
Okay. Panel, anybody like to have ideas of how, because I'm sure it has happened to, I mean, it has, I know, into your communities too. What have been some strategies that you've seen to have done that's been effective? If I think I did, there's a group called Holler Back, and they have 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So if you go online, and I'll make sure I put that in the chat, they have a website that has wonderful resources on what to do with bystanders if you see something happening. Okay, 5 different ways you can react. I think one of the things that you can't prevent all these attacks. I mean, you don't know who, right? And you don't know when. But when it happens, one of the things that a lot of people, you freeze, you don't know what to do. So if you have these strategies in mind, maybe you can help in that situation. So that's one resource. Panel, you have other ideas or? Okay.
May I say something?
Yeah.
Okay. Our friend for Pastor Sebastian, our friend that's friend of our church, he's spoken a couple of times already. My African-American buddy, Andre Chapman in San Jose. And I mentioned to him one time, actually a couple of days ago, about if we could get, the police, the authorities, to FBI people to make statements that this is not okay. We're going to arrest whoever you are. I don't care what color you are. We're going to arrest you guys. You're going to be in trouble. His comment to me was this, and I never thought of this. He said, do you think these bad actors watch 11 o'clock news all the time? And do you think they really care? They don't care about that. He said, what they care about is, because they're young people usually, many times, and they listen to social media. So they see what's on Instagram, Twitter, and so he said that's one thing that has to be approached. And I never thought of that because I wouldn't know how to do that stuff. But there are people that do understand this.
Okay.
I think that made sense.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else we have one more question we can ask the panel, and then we need to move on. So any other questions?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that one because we can't even stop police from shooting innocent Black men and women. I'm just not being quiet. I just don't have an answer.
Yeah, I don't think any of us do. So it's probably going to be a multi-pronged approach. And okay. Lone had one. Lone, did you want me to ask that question? You want to ask it? You want me to ask it, or you want to ask it? Why don't you ask it, Lone?
Oh yeah, it's just just wanted to throw out this question, but I mean, we all have some kind of ideas, but just want to sync with you all. What's your utopia in on your racism issue? And that's the first thing that, we need to know what's the end game, or you need to know what's the big picture of it. And are we supposed to be colorblind? That's a question many times I have, people ask, so, and also I also asking that similar question. And then, or in what natural condition that our diversity is seen without racial or any bias prospects in our lives, then in our dealing with. So what is the natural condition that we supposed to be? So
you're a theologian.
Oh, no, I'm not. Just throwing out
The theological questions there. Abner and Will, you two haven't said any much, so you want to answer?
Well,
It's in the chat too, so.
Okay, yes, so the first question is very interesting because yes, the utopia, to see something or a place perfect, it's very difficult in our human nature, right, as a human being. But I think one of the steps that I think for that is to unlearn many things that we have learned from the prejudices of our country, our culture, maybe. I can say many things that I heard in Puerto Rico from other cultures. And again, being here and sharing with people, I understood that, no, this is wrong. This is very wrong. And I think that process, and this is a very theological process as well, is to unlearn many things that we learn. And again, to learn with the people from different cultures, from different maybe places, to learn what is there, or the sense, or about how have we been wrong in that sense. But I think discrimination, racism, is learned. I think it's learned in that sense. But
Will?
utopia,
Okay.
it's very interesting, that word.
Sorry, Will, did you want to say anything?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. What you just said. Racism is not something I don't believe, from my perspective. You know, that you're born with, you're taught, it's learned. You know, from a very early age. The environment that you're around, the people who you associate with, who you talk to, you know, and that's learned at a very, very early age, and that stays in you throughout your lifetime, you know, unless you do something about it to change that. And sad to say, a lot of people have not changed that, you know, and they are who they are, you know, and a lot of times people speak out of their own ignorance, and sometimes that really frustrates me because they don't know who I am, they don't know what I am, where I come from, my background, and I think that if we learn each other's culture to maybe as much as you can, you begin to understand that culture, you know, and you can see where they're coming from, to, you know, maybe not to the full picture, but you can see where they're coming from. And you know, that's how I do it. You know, I try to hear with a listening ear and to learn from their perspective, what they have to say. I may not always agree with it, you know, but I want to hear what they have to say and be open and to be receptive of that, you know, and to understand them, you know, and to know that I'm there to not to put them down, but to encourage them, to help them, and even pray for them. I think that from different ethnic races we come from, you know, we do that, but yet to some degree it's not being done enough. Even from my perspective, from the Native American perspective, even from our own tribes, there's 569 federally recognized tribes. I'm Kiowa, and for example, the Sioux Indians up in South Dakota. Yes, we're Native American, but I don't know them. I don't speak their language. They have it. They practice their traditions and their cultural different than the Kiowas do. We have some similarities, but one time several years ago, I went up there to preach a revival on the Sioux Reservation, and they said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Oklahoma." Well, they said, "Go back home. You're not from here," you know. So, and they weren't joking; they were serious. But anyway, those are the things I've experienced. Okay. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to close our time. The panelists have been wonderful. Thank you very much, and I hope that you're open, panelists, for future sessions, because we're just beginning the conversation and we need to pursue it more. Not only just learn from each other, but to just to grow and to be able to become, to relate to each other so that we can become true allies with each other. And that's our hope, and that's our desire. I think that's really God's kingdom right there. Not to be colorblind, but to be color blessed. So we would we are blessed with each of our different colors. Well, thank you again, panelists, and let's just all give, even in our silence, give them a great hand. And I'm going to turn it over now to Amelia, who will lead us into breakout groups.